For those who have careers that keep them out at sea for long periods of time, what is the creepiest thing you've seen out in the water? 1. Not so much what I saw, but what I experienced. I was once underway in the Gulf of Alaska during a November gale. Waves were up to 35 feet, with some rollers hitting 45. An uncommon occurrence on the diesel-electric ship I was on was a cycloconverter tripping. When this happened, the ship would temporarily completely lose power and propulsion until some electricians could reset everything. This happened during that gale. I simply can't explain how strange it is for the boat you're on to all of a sudden go so quiet that you can clearly hear waves slapping the ship and metal bending and flexing, knowing you're completely at the mercy of the sea, knowing that if the ship lost its bearing and went beam to, there was a real possibility of capsizing. It's easy to forget when you're at sea that the only thing keeping you alive is a bunch of steel welded together. At that moment, I was fully aware, and it humbled me. Thankfully, we trained frequently for this, and had everything fired back up relatively quickly. Another time I recall was when the ship took a rogue wave. They are absolutely real, and I believe they account for a massive number of shipwrecks. It was late at night, and I was on the bridge. We were passing through a storm, and we're taking the waves off the bow with no visibility. As the ship moves, there's normally a pretty standard pattern. You ride up a wave for a bit, and then you fall down the wave for a bit. Well, we started riding up a wave and got to the point where we should have been starting, or ride down, but we just kept climbing and climbing. And then it happened. We started our ride down the back of this massive wave. All of us braced ourselves and tried to find something to hold on to, but we all fell to the deck anyway. Anything that wasn't secured for sea fell down all around us. Manuals, tables, computers, printers, you name it. Our captain, who was sleeping, called up to the bridge asking if we hit something. It woke the entire crew up. Rogue waves are real, and they're terrifying. I can't imagine being in a smaller boat or taking one of them broadside. 2. I was in the U.S. Navy for about 10 years and have tens of thousands of miles at sea in an aircraft carrier. Countless nights on the flight deck in the middle of the night and middle of the ocean. Creepiest. A huge patch of the ocean glowing, like nuclear waste in The Simpsons glowing. I've seen bioluminescent algae of a few kinds, and this was nothing like it. I've never seen anything like it before or since. Weirdest thing. Hundreds of miles out to sea from land, and there was a massive fire on the water. It was like the top of a gas refinery, but on the water with nothing under it but water. Flame going a few stories into the air. Saddest. A fellow sailor trying to jump overboard. He apparently got a Dear John email and pictures from his cheating wife and decided to end it. We were on the smoke deck. He bummed a cigarette, then asked the time. We said 2,300. He replied, "Sounds like a good time to die," and in one motion tried to launch over the chest-high wall with an opening to the water below. Luckily, we were faster than him. We grabbed his legs and wrestled him down and laid on him and basically hog-tied him till the MAs, Navy cops, got there. Broke my heart because he was a good dude. I never saw him again. He got transferred off the ship shortly after. Not sure what happened to him, but I hope he's doing better. Funniest. 2 flying fish collide mid-air. I was smoking when we were in the Persian Gulf and saw the fish fly from a pretty far distance towards each other. I remember thinking, there's no fucking way they're gonna hit them splat, splash. I was in tears laughing, but no one saw it. Everyone just thought I was a weirdo. But I got to see a miracle of nature, lol. 3. The furthest I've ever been out to sea was bay fishing, so I'm not qualified to say based on my personal experience, haha. But one story that scares the shit out of me is of a Chinese submarine that got caught in an eddy. Ocean eddies are kind of like enormous whirlpools. They can be at or below the water surface. Some are large enough to be seen from orbit. Anyway, this sub was caught in an eddy and was beginning to drift downwards towards crush depth. Obviously that's pretty scary, but what drives it over the edge to me is that the eddy was pulling them downwards in the direction of a trench. Since they're in a sub, they can't just see outside. It's almost like there was something in the trench that grabbed them and started pulling them down into the abyss. They jettisoned and eventually were able to break free before their sub was crushed and lost to the dark void forever. But the idea of your sub suddenly stopping, going in reverse against your will, and then realizing that you're headed towards an oceanic trench is just next level for me. I'm pretty grounded, but the ocean gets my imagination going. This powerful sub got caught by something and started getting dragged down towards a trench. Yeah, it was an eddy doing it, but yish. The imagination comes up with disturbing questions. 4. Creepiest thing I've seen has definitely been seeing myself and other crewmates lose our minds. On one particularly awful voyage, everything that could go wrong went wrong, and we found ourselves without food, water, and sleep for a very unhealthy amount of time. It started off with auditory hallucinations. Ships are noisy, And when you're going crazy, you begin to think those noises are talking to you. I heard children laughing, a choir singing, and creepiest of all, a particular splash sounded like it was calling my name from the sea. Combine that with visual hallucinations, and then things get really terrifying. I was convinced we were in the desert at one point, with sand all around us, and mountains in the distance. Another crew member freaked out and told us we were about to run into an apartment building. The creepiest thing I saw was an all-black flying pig with red eyes on the bow. I think the scariest, though, was when someone was convinced we lost part of our crew overboard. It turned into a massive, delirious argument over where everyone was, even though we were all accounted for. That trip was brutal, and the captain put us all in a terrible situation due to sheer incompetence. Other than that, there was this one time I saw 3 gigantic ships in the distance with no lights, and they did not show up on AIS. Suddenly, they were gone. It was extremely creepy. 5 years ago, my friends and I visited Thailand and went on several excursions on a boat with a captain. On one of the evenings, we were out at night, and it was pitch black, except for the green lights that were coming from the large commercial fishing boats way out in the distance. We had stopped for a while to take in the view and eat. When it started to rain, the captain thought it was best to head back, and then quickly realized that the boat propeller wasn't working, and something was caught on it. He grabbed his head-mounted flashlight and a knife and jumped in the water. He was gone for a good minute, which felt like eternity, as we were huddled around, trying to figure out what was happening. Fear started kicking in as we waited. Then he suddenly re-emerged panting and told us that shortly after he jumped in, he lost his flashlight and had to literally feel his way underwater towards the propeller, reaching and cutting a plastic tarp that had wound itself around the propeller, cut it loose, and made his way back to the surface in the dark. It was a strange set of emotions as we were completely impressed with the badass display we just witnessed. Relieved he made it back, but also freaked out imagining what would have happened if he hadn't. 6. I was in a glass-bottom boat in the 1970s off the coast of Oahu. We were going out to see a pod of whales. The boat captain was a grizzled old Hawaiian sun, baked to the color of mahogany. It was an older boat, retrofit with a glass bottom and bench seating. He was narrating over a PA as we left the dock. We motored out for about 30 minutes. And the view out of the bottom of the boat was disappointing, just long streams of bubbles obscuring the view. Finally, he stopped the boat, and the view was simply amazing. The captain pointed out a pod of whales about 1/4 of a mile away. They were cavorting about, diving and jumping. The captain was explaining their behaviors, but keeping his distance. It was pretty cool. All the whales suddenly dived and disappeared, emerging moments later, right next to our boat. They were swimming all around us, diving and jumping and splashing us with water. Children were laughing. Everyone thought it was part of the show. They were right there, almost so close that you could touch them. The captain told us how lucky we were to see them up close. Suddenly, the mood changed when they started bumping up against the hull of the small boat. People were sliding all over the place. Some fell onto the floor. Children were crying. Most telling, the captain had stopped narrating and had a look of abject terror on his face. I remember thinking what it must take to make this guy scared. And as he looked terrified, we should probably be too. Suddenly, as quickly as they appeared, the whales disappeared. They were just gone. People picked themselves up and sat back down. Mothers consoled children. We started back to the dock. The captain got back on the PA and tried to downplay the seriousness of what just happened, but there was a definite quiver in his voice as we headed back to shore. 7. Right. Mostly tankers. Crude oil, VLCC, and refined product tankers, but with a little time in oil and gas and towing. I came ashore in 2017 with a Master Unlimited ticket, sailing as chief officer. My last ship was a self-discharging bulk carrier. Anyway, I digress. It wasn't so much about what I saw, which was creepy. I saw plenty of interesting things I wouldn't have seen anywhere else. However, I was second mate on a tanker distributing refined oil products around the coast of New Zealand. A yacht had sailed from a port on the east coast, bound for another port just down the coast a bit, but it had disappeared. Solo sailor on board, aside from his dog. Nonetheless, the search proved fruitless, and it was suspended. However, for weeks afterwards, at about 0130 in the morning, the Rescue Coordination Center would broadcast a plea at the end of the weather and navigation warning. Broadcast asking for the yacht to make contact if it could hear the message and was able to do so. I'd sit in the dark, chain smoking and working on my 7th cup of coffee, looking out into the black, imagining the guy who's had a stroke or heart attack on board, with the same broadcast playing out on his radio while his dog ate his face to keep from starving. Or imagining him having fallen over the side, imagining what it'd be like watching your yacht sailing indifferently off into the distance with your dog in the cockpit pacing and agitated, unable to do anything about it. Knowing you were fucked and had a matter of hours, if that left to live before the cold got you, or exhaustion. Or imagining the dog starving and dying on a yacht by itself weeks later listening to the same broadcast in the dark. The places your mind goes in the dark by yourself. They found the yacht in the end. The dog was still alive. 8. Nothing too extensive like some of the stories here, but I worked as a tuna fisherman for a tiny bit, where I'd spend 3 to 4 weeks out at a time, taking around 3 days of 24-hour travel to get where we, me and one other person, the captain who was a 5th-generation fisherman, were fishing. So many stories of insane things that I could be here all night. But one was near the end of the season, and we pushed out farther than we should have, over 100 nautical miles, where we had no business being as a 37-foot trawler. And then we're caught in a bad storm. I had barely enough time to, very carefully, board up all of the windows before the boat started scooping. When coming down one of the 12-feet waves, the first third of the boat dives underwater before popping back up, only to travel up another wave and do it again and again as waves got larger and things got worse. Basically, the captain and I stayed the cabin, bracing ourselves with each wave, staring at the radar in hopes we could stay in the position of taking the waves head-on and avoid being capsized. After a few minutes, and the fear that this 5th-generation fisherman was exuding, I just accepted that I was going to die there. And the experience of that acceptance and the event itself had a profound effect on my perception and the way I've lived life afterward. We eventually made it out, and didn't say a lot to each other afterward. Lots of stories from that time, but this was the creepiest, I'd say. 9. A few things come to mind, but I have to say, deadheads. In my younger days, I was captain of a dragger out of Kodiak, Alaska. She was a 130-feet Giddings marine trawler. I will never forget my first week in the wheelhouse, with the owner, who was retiring, and showing me the operation before I took over. After a night busting ice off the rails in freezing rain and 2-meter seas, he went to bunk and left me to wheel watch. It was clearing up with a medium haze and flat, calm waters. Most of the crew was sleeping or hanging out in the galley, so I was alone and the only eyes forward. I'm drinking some nasty Folgers and sucking down a Marlboro Red when I see what looked like an old pier piling, straight ahead. I kept looking at that spot and, nope, nothing there. A few seconds later, I swear I saw that thing again, but only closer. Nope, gone again. I thought, shit, I've been up way too long and I'm fucking hallucinating. Then, out of nowhere, this tree trunk shoots directly up into the sky. This thing had to be 60 feet tall and was about 30 feet off the bow. Dead center. I damn near shit myself. I pushed to port and rubbed the tree with the right side of the bow. We were at a good 14-knot clip, which is fast as hell for an almost fully loaded trawler. Then it shot down and disappeared about midship. I later learned that these are pretty uncommon in the Aleutians, where we were fishing. They're called deadheads, and only 2 of the guys on the boat had seen them before. They float vertically and bob straight up and down. These things were known to destroy older wood boats and kill crews. I'm just glad I wasn't dragging the net, and it would have cost us in the ballpark of $100K. I've seen what most people would consider worse, but the fear that a huge bobbing tree in the middle of Alaskan waters come out of fucking nowhere tops my list. 10. I'm not a sailor at all, but I did a few boat trips with a friend who moved boats around for a living. He was usually carrying boats from the French Riviera, Monaco, Nice, Antibes, Cannes, to Corsica. My very first trip with him. We left from Monaco on our way to, I think, Calvi. We left in the evening, and the trip started very well, with dolphins following us around. Nice moment. Around 2 a.m., in the middle of a pitch-black night, very far from any coast, we saw a tiny light in the distance, pretty much on our way. And as we got closer, we saw it was a tiny fishing boat, the kind that usually doesn't go very far from the coast, except we were more than 100 kilometers from the coast. We slowed down as we got close to it, and yelled to check if someone was on it. No answer, so we decided to get close to it. And soon it became obvious it was empty. There were just a few bottles of water, some snacks, some fishing gear, even some dead fish in a bucket, and an old Nokia phone, still on, but nobody on. My friend called on the radio, explaining the situation. Italian Coast Guards told us to wait around till they arrived. We did, and when they arrived, they told us they would investigate the situation. They took our ID, wrote down our explanation of the situation, and let us leave to finish our trip. The whole thing was creepy to me, as it seemed obvious the owner had fallen from his boat, couldn't get back in, and drowned. I had this in mind for weeks, thinking we could maybe have rescued the guy if we had passed there slightly earlier. After a while, this story faded in my mind, and I went on with my life. Till someday my friend called me to explain that he got a call from an Italian guy, who thanked him because he could get his boat back thanks to us. He was the owner of the tiny boat, who explained he was out fishing not too far from the shore when he had a big chest pain. He made an emergency call and was soon rescued, but his boat was left to drift till we found it. Learning that the guy was still alive erased the creepy side of this story from my head, and I was happy about it. 11. Contract mariner. I disappear into the blue area for 6 to 8 months a year. Creepy? Not much, honestly. The sound of moaning steel due to slack tanks when you're rolling really hard can be a bit unnerving. St. Elmo's fire is pretty neat. Fata Morgana, aka the Flying Dutchman, is pretty cool to see in real life. After a while, the only thing out there that really spooks you is a problem you have that directly influences your survival. All the spooky shit I've ever been a part of have been no bullshit emergencies. Fire in the engine control room? I am the first responder down there to see if it's an actual emergency or a fucked up concilium sensor. Wall of toxic smoke from burning electronics and the high voltage room? Oh fuck. Have an emergency weather sortie. Because we are dragging anchor and rolling 30 degrees with 50 feet UKC, and we're getting pushed toward the island? Fuck me, 10 shots ain't enough. We are about to run aground in a 55,000-ton, 800 feet ship. Pucker factor. Oops, now we get the hookup to get the fuck out of there. We immediately lose steering and propulsion? Good shit. I've seen brand new $1 million sport fishers capsized and bobbing around like a cork 1,000 miles from land. I've seen tiny little songbirds skipping along the surface just barely clinging to life, but they're flying as hard as they can to find land. Some of the saddest shit I've ever seen are those little birds skipping off the water as they fly further out to sea hoping to all fuck they come across some land. I don't know. I'm on the Ewing at a port bar and I'm rambling. To answer your question TLDR style. The creepiest thing about being out there are the bottomless depths of sadness, loneliness, and heartache. You will go places in your mind that words will never be able to do any justice in trying to describe. 12. Was on a 2-week cruise on a huge ship, and one morning there was a ton of commotion coming from one side of he ship. It looked like a woman had fallen off the ship and was in the water below, face down in a summer dress. Her hair sprawling around her as she lay face down and completely motionless in the water, bobbing up and down as she was carried by the gentle waves of the ocean. You think you're tough until you see some shit like that. People were crying, taking their curious kids elsewhere. Others were frantically trying to find staff to go rescue her. As it turns out, a woman had left her sundress and wig out to dry on her balcony the night before, and the wind that morning had blown it into the water. An announcement was made, and everyone was so relieved, and there was a lot of laughter. It was surreal to see everyone going from such worried, sad expressions, some were outright bawling their eyes out, to completely in hysterics laughing and hugging one another. I think we were all reminded of how precious life was that day, and it really was a huge relief. It was terrible in the moments where we thought it was an actual person. What made it believable is that you're up so high on this ship, it's hard to see details down below, because of the distance along with the waves and water obscuring finer details. My friends and I, who were on the cruise together, drank and laughed a lot that night. It was a very sobering event.